Welcome back to Recurrent Conversation or Recurrent Events, episode 2, and I'm already forgetting the title. And back with me is Mr. Wes Schantz. Welcome back, Mr. Wes Schantz.
Hey, it's good to be back. Long time no see.
Long time no see. We had the pleasure of recording a night school right before this, and so it'll be interesting to make this pivot. And so something about this week and these last couple of weeks and sort of what this project is I thought I might be able to comment a little bit on what's been happening on YouTube and sort of some of the events I'm most interested in that sort of Jonathan Haidt and Jordan B. Peterson and Ben Shapiro sort of circle around and talk about, and how those might figure into this. They're generally issues of education and how to educate in the most sort of psychologically verified and scientifically informed way, and how that might tie in with what's happening within a broader context as well. And I'm mostly thinking that because it's Saturday and it's a day that I get to listen to podcasts, and I've been listening recently to IDW figures, intellectual dark web figures, Ben Shapiro, who is a Republican, Jordan Peterson, who calls himself classical liberal, which means essentially libertarian, and Dave Rubin, who is a former Democrat, a young Turk, and now sort of also classical liberal or libertarian. And that said, Wes, I thought you should probably take the lead when it comes to which current events that we should actually talk about, because I think I've been in sort of a cave this week, so I might need you to enlighten me on this.
Okay. No, that sounds like a fun cave to be in anyhow. Those guys I haven't listened to Rubin or Shapiro hardly at all. I have listened to a lot of Peterson's material that's out there, and I find his whole phenomenon very interesting. I don't know how much I jive with his politics per se, or the intellectual dark web and what its effect is on politics. That's a whole can of worms. We could probably talk about that if you're interested in doing that today. The main thing I was interested in, and then maybe it kind of connects actually, is all these wildfires that have been burning up and down California for the past, I don't know, whole year, decade, I don't know, long time. Seems to be sort of impinging on people's consciousness that this is a major problem now, and people don't seem sure about what to do about it. One big thing that came out just recently, I know that there was a report on climate that was released on Black Friday, actually, and was kind of part of the big news about it was that it was released on a day when people would tend not to maybe notice it as much, and people were kind of speculating about what was going on with that. Obviously, I haven't read the document. I'm not a climate expert of any kind, and I just, both of us live on the West Coast, and you live in California, so maybe could give us kind of a eyewitness report and just like what's the sentiment around there. And well, it's a fiery thing, right? So maybe that kind of connects with the conversations and podcasts and stuff that you have been listening to lately. So just have at it with that.
Well, the fires have been affecting people, generally people north of San Diego, people north of the LA area, like broadly speaking, around the Santa Barbara and just 4 hours north of me area, as well as in Northern California. Though it's sort of sad, I haven't been following that news super closely just because it doesn't have a super direct effect on me. But there are plenty of people on Facebook, for example, who are like saying marking themselves safe. And my girlfriend's sort of physician friend, her parents were evacuated at some point. So there is a realness to it. And we have had wildfires that affected us down in San Diego County before. And I remember just going about my daily business with every shop I would go into, there would be the news on and reports of where the fire currently was, and often images of like old men like spraying their lawns with their hoses and shooting it at the fire until the last moment.
Oh my God.
Trying to protect, where they're from, which it reminded me quite a bit of Hurricane Katrina when people were making preparations for her. I was at college at that time, and the year before there had been a Category 4 storm that missed us. So the general sentiment was that Katrina would not hit us. And there was just, there's sort of still that attitude of we're going to stick it out as long as possible, as with those fires. Like maybe the unthinkable will not happen. But that's essentially the extent that I've thought it through on. But it is funny because I know we try to take responsible for whatever issues that we see and use our minds to apply ourselves to them, whether they be intellectual issues, abstract, or practical issues. But it really does seem like somebody ought to do something about that, or that we ought to do some thinking about how to make these fires less destructive. And I just don't know, just in the broadest possible sweeps, like would less forest be more helpful when it comes to this? Like, is there an amount of forest like that like an amount of, I don't know, hair on a body that becomes non-optimal, right? Something I think I heard on HBO once is that tusked creatures, part of their function is to uproot small trees so that overforestation doesn't happen. But I don't know to what extent that's actually our particular problem. Maybe we could get somebody on the show, a forestry or climate expert who could tell us a little bit about what the problem really is, so we could think it through.
Oh yeah. Yeah. As you were saying that, I was thinking that it does seem like such a huge problem. I had made that connection to Katrina also. Like that was the last time there was such a huge catastrophic natural disaster, but one which again people weighed in on in terms of like, what is our responsibility here? Like it's a Noah's flood kind of problem, right? The way that you can think about that is that on the one hand it's happening, right? It's not something that you can control. It's much bigger than that. But on the other hand, you can prepare, right? You can be ready when it does happen, and you can survive it and help others survive it, and you can be better prepared to pick up the pieces after those 40 days and nights, right? And kind of rebuild and all that. So there's a interesting parallel there. The other thing that struck me as you were describing, maybe it was the image of the old people trying to water their lawns and stuff, right? And like keep the fires at bay. Gosh, it's like we often kind of wonder what our controlling narrative is in these days, now that, you know, the sense of a kind of high culture has kind of faded. It's been eroded in various ways. And so it's probably not so much a single epic sort of story anymore, so much as it is the underlying mythic foundations of those stories, right? This is the kind of stuff we talk about on our other podcasts, and definitely the kind of stuff that Peterson is very articulate about on his shows and things. But as we were talking, like I was thinking maybe what we have instead of a grand encompassing narrative now is basically the news, right? It's like that's the thing that everybody watches, and that's the thing that everybody is talking about, like on Facebook, on cable TV, on the radio, like everywhere. So in a sense, that's like performing the function of that old, you know, religious, spiritual tradition, right, or whatever kind of narrative it may be. In a sense, that's kind of what we've got instead, and it's an interesting problem then how to frame that narrative and how to talk about it. I'm starting to see that this project is very intimately related with our other podcasting projects and inquiries.
Well, I agree. And interestingly enough, it was Shapiro, not Peterson, that made this point. That he said that what makes Twitter so ugly is that it's a gathering ground without purpose. So something we know from psychology is that if you are extroverted, you will seek attention. And if you can't get positive attention, so you don't develop the skills or behaviors necessary, you'll seek negative attention. You'll settle for that. So if you're on Twitter and there's nothing to do, you're sort of like a student in a classroom with nothing to do. You're eventually going to do something just for something to happen. And it seems like when the news takes sort of an amoral perspective, or even an explicitly political perspective, it does serve as a cohesive for all of us, but without a sort of spirited direction or a motion forward towards a specific goal, right? A sense of, it doesn't have the inspiring element. It has more of a mob sort of element. It seems like what it is missing that a grand narrative has is a grand narrative gives structure and purpose to the existence of a people, because it draws them together into something which is larger than they are, which they are willing to work for, like building some pyramids to be eternal, or, founding the city and the people that will eventually become Romans who will last for 1,000 years. People want to be a part of something great. But if they don't have that as an option, if they have gotten rid of that, if God is dead, as Nietzsche wrote and Peterson often talks about, and we have the blood on our hands, and we can't get that positive attention in meeting together in order to do something useful, right? Like playing a basketball game or being a part of a chorus, something where we gather together and refine ourselves in order to generate a better product or experience, then we just are sort of settling for the least common denominator, which is just, here's some stuff that happens. Possibly we're just going to illustrate some of the worst aspects of our being as well, rather than offering a more balanced narrative, depending on who it is we think we're serving. And I don't know. While you were talking, that did make me think about, if you do not have a grand overarching narrative, what do you have instead? And is it a better substitute? And if it isn't, should you look for a grand overarching narrative?
Yeah, right. See, here's a way to think about that. Maybe like back when Al Gore was sort of doing his thing about climate change, he was, I think, one of the big megaphoned voices out there saying, here is the challenge for this era, right? Like, here is our grand problem that we need to solve together. And climate change, remains a major problem. But maybe part of the thing was that Al Gore just proved to be not a great poet, right? Like, he wasn't able to tell that story in a compelling way to enough people that it sort of caught on. And so it remained a bit of a niche thing, and remains so. There's climate change activists who are super engaged and articulate about the problems and this and that, but it hasn't evolved to the standard of, like, fighting communism back in a previous generation, or the counterculture against the war, the civil rights movement. All of these kinds of things sort of gained that mass level to where they did sort of drive society as a whole in a positive direction. Whereas now it seems to be, that there's a variety of competing interests, and on Twitter and on other public forums and things, you see a lot of heat and not a lot of light generated by them. And at least it's not the kind of physical violence so much, right? There is still, police violence is a big one, and sorts of, school shootings, as we discussed a long time ago on a previous kind of iteration of these discussions. Those are certainly out there. All sorts of real violence are out there, but in many ways they've been perhaps mitigated or superseded by this other kind of heated discussion, and the amount of attention that's given to that is a very new thing, and I guess we haven't quite figured out yet how to best apply its power to solving problems, right? Rather than sort of making much of them.
Well, it's amazing too because something that was talked about, which is part of the problem with, say, Twitter, is that you're sort of all Zorro. You're all masked, like V for Vendetta. And so that does make you more de-individuated and more willing to do evil things, as we know from the Stanford sort of Stanley Milgram experiments, and which we could not, which supposedly could not be done with ethics boards today. But that what if all these people who are currently like trolls hiding under bridges who could in some way get credit for what they do, all the time they spend on the computer? Maybe there could be a forum where, and we do know that this sort of works, right? With things like World of Warcraft, like that is a game structure and with a narrative underlying it, which gives a goal structure and thus sort of creates a hierarchy of behaviors for people that they then engage in and will pay for with time and effort and money for their own personal enjoyment, right? What if we could do something like that, but that just produce data on what a human is? And in fact, I think actually we are sort of doing that. We should just be like sifting through that data from sort of things like the massive multiplayer online RPGs and the sort of choices that people make, whether they're good players, bad players, and that will tell us quite a bit about ourselves, and that all this time we've been spending on the internet has not been wasted, but has been producing, I think, the most complete picture of what a human is that has ever existed, like a real mirror.
That would be a really interesting take on the big data sort of that problem that people have of privacy, of identity, which has been greatly exacerbated by our profound inability to stop using these sites, right? So it's like no matter what, you're putting all this stuff about yourself out there. Yeah, so maybe finding a way to interpret it and apply it I think another part of that might be to give people a sense of the potential that's out there, besides getting clicks, right? Besides like that kind of drive for quantity of attention, as you're saying, which leads to a kind of anomie or right, a lack of identity, and anonymity rather. Instead of that, finding ways to sort of build more recognizable community among people who are, maybe separated in space, but really quite, aligned in terms of their interests. And so this is like, I think, a kind of a lacuna, a hole in the online education right now. It's very much about getting numbers of people to watch your video or your lesson or whatever, right? But there isn't a whole lot of space there for discussion among people and for like give and take and questioning and stuff like that. I think that's an area too. So to kind of go with the idea about researching data that's generated online, maybe creating more spaces for discussion and have some form of not necessarily guidance, but at least a model for what that would look like, perhaps. And so like one area that is really interesting to me about Peterson's project, he's talking about doing this university online to help people, become more versed in a whole range of topics, and as you said, like to make education more responsive to scientific understanding of like human motivation and stuff like that. All that sounds great. I'd like to know what his plan is for like interaction among students, like besides just accessing the content and sort of taking quizzes and whatever, writing papers. Like, are there going to be discussion sections? Are they going to have opportunities to get to know one another? Because I think if not, yeah, you're going to see a lot of these same kinds of problems cropping up where people are seeking attention, which is natural and probably good, but not able to really represent themselves in a very good light as they do so. Yeah. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. It just, I suppose, yeah, it's just so many levels down the line that it's hard to consider exactly what that problem will look like when it takes shape, right? Because there is also sort of that massive multiplayer online RPG element where people do convene together, or on Reddit or on YouTube where people will do it right. So it's hard to say. Yeah, I think that taking into account the fact that humans are social and that there should be a social component to an online university, and that will take some sophisticated solution to figure out, because replacing just running into people is part of the theory for why there's actually political polarization right now, right? Jonathan Haidt and Lukianoff argue that Newt Gingrich around 1994 changed the culture of Washington by making all the meetings the middle of the week, and instead of having the House of Representatives members move their families to the DC area where they could mingle with each other and have their children go to school together and stuff, he had them leave their families at home and just flew them in so that they could be more of a, like, not militant, but goal directed and just like focused team mentality. And that sort of lack of proximity between people who were Republicans and Democrats who would have their kids again in the same schools and live in the same space has made it easier to take a more combative stance against each other. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I haven't read that book yet. You're referring to Coddling of the American Mind?
Right.
I still have that on hold at the library, and it hasn't come through yet. I think a lot of people are busily reading or trying to read that book. I'm really interested. I did listen to a podcast the other day where he's talking to Ezra Klein of Fox News about that sort of stuff. And there's a lot of really smart people, I feel like, out there looking at just these problems. And so I'm pretty, I don't know, maybe not optimistic, but open to the idea that there are some solutions, or at least some ways to mitigate and redirect a lot of this attention and effort in more productive channels.
Yes, I do think that's what we want to do. Like, yeah. I agree with you completely. I mean, that's not only a possibility. Like, I think that's a reality. All we have to do is define the space better and better, what the goal is. And I think it's probably going to come down to people who are willing to articulate what their goals actually are. And then people can, in sort of a democratic way, choose whether they want to be a part of that or not.
Yeah. I'm excited then to keep kind of building on these online courses and making some kind of space for people to do the deeper discussion and to get to know people who have similar interests but perhaps different beliefs and maybe different presuppositions that are driving their interest in some of these big problems. That's a direction that I am really interested in going, and I agree that we should start having, I think we said this last time too, whenever we last talked on this platform, to have some people join us for these conversations would be really cool.
That was the thought that just popped into my mind, that really does strike me as the next thing to be doing.
Yeah.
To be inviting people on and getting their perspective and asking them questions And that's something I'm interested in doing soon too, having a meeting, and maybe we can record that and maybe even publish it depending on what comes from it or what doesn't come from it too. I think could be valuable about how we wish to continue to contribute to this project and what it is we think we're contributing. Because I would say what we're contributing is a real liberal sort of late high school, college education right now through the various courses that we're laying out there in a professorial way. And that, well, you know, I, as I've often said to you in other segments, I'd like to do this for the next 50 years or so, maybe longer, depending on how long we live. We live pretty healthily on this West Coast, which we're so lucky to live on. Well, you know, in the West anyway. I'm technically on the coast. But
No, as long as the forest fires keep at bay, well, yeah, that'll be fine.
Right. And the earthquakes that haven't been around as much, but are a constant threat, and the great whites that are out in the ocean. You know, there are plenty of things, and you know, we have a lot of highways. They're dangerous too. But yeah, it'll be interesting to continue to define the space in a more concrete way. We're getting closer to the middle of the mandala, I would say, and I think providing something valuable for people. And as we expose more people to our work and bring them in to do their own work alongside us, I think I sort of visualize a giant Hephaestian workshop where people are just doing what they've mastered. And it's sort of the ultimate American ideal, but also the ultimate university ideal, right? Like, look at all these masters doing what they do, who you can learn from if you want to. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a crucial component of it, I think, is that it's voluntary. And what I guess that's maybe one of the bigger aspects of this is what that will do then to impact the way that public schools operate, right? Which are not voluntary. They're just like a part of life. And so far as they are, people sort of take that for granted. I think changing the attitude towards education is a big part of my sort of larger design here, and it's something that I've definitely been working on in some concrete ways with, like, you know, podcasts and writing and all that good stuff. But would love to do. I think that ultimately it will involve some kind of more political organization, whether that be getting involved with like local school board stuff or advocacy or unionizing or like whatever form that would take. That's another area that I'm kind of interested in going with this, since this is sort of our political space here. But that's something that I'm just very unversed in. And so one of the first people that I think I'd want to have on here to talk is Joe Worthy. I was just visiting him over Thanksgiving, and he knows a lot more, and he's a lot more connected with people who know more stuff with organizing and politics and how that works. I think we should also have your frequent contributor, Matt Roos, on to talk about some of the neuroscience, the data, that sort of thing, or people that he knows, you know, that he thinks would be interested in going down some of those rabbit holes with us. So that's just to throw out like a couple possible avenues to go from here for next time.
Interesting. And just being more of the armchair person that I am, just thinking about what the most effective mode of political expression would be, knowing now some of the things we do about human perceptual systems, that which, you know, how peaceful, say organizing but insistent with a specific messaging could catch the eyes of people in a way that, like, say, the messaging of Occupy Wall Street and such couldn't, because it didn't it didn't have a specific concrete goal to pursue. That it did, and it also failed to have a grand narrative, right, behind it. And so, if there were going to be sort of a change, it would be interesting to see what actions best manifested or embodied a grand narrative, and whether the better the narrative is that the people are telling themselves and are that gives them the goal that they're pursuing, the sort of better the outcome, or the better the or the more transformative the change that they make. I'd be very interested to understand more about that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. The impact of one's story about what one is doing does seem incredibly significant. And yeah, perhaps tied to success and failure, but also, I don't know, maybe in that respect, I think that failures might be more important than successes, actually, because that gives you the sense that you're still engaged in a process, right? Whereas if you
That's right.
succeed with your goal, then you're sort of at a loss because you've accomplished it, right? So then what? You just sort of settle in and enjoy. I think that's, quite dangerous and doesn't make for a very interesting story.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because you relate sort of the story of the Old Testament there, right? Of complacency followed by something terrible happening, like enslavement, and but also sort of that's something I recently watched this ESPN Plus documentary, Earn Everything, that follows Coach Mike Krzyzewski around and his new team, which is so exciting to watch. But he constantly talks about. Oh, sorry, I'm losing the point. Having thought about that exciting team and the fact that they're actually coming on in a few minutes, I'm forgetting the
success and failure. Is it?
He says failure is not an endpoint. Failure is part of the process, and he says, you just got to move on to the next situation, and it's part of a pattern. And so, as a musician, you make a mistake, you got to keep moving on, and what you'll be judged by is, did you get back up? Sort of like Guitar Hero. Did you get 99% of the notes right afterwards, or did you just fall apart? That's what someone terrible does. And that's also very much a part of the epic tradition with the Odyssey and the Aeneid. Odysseus is constantly failing to get home. His men betray him. His men foolishly get themselves killed, and over and over again he gets closer and then farther from Ithaca. His own men opening the bag of winds when they are within sight of Ithaca. And so he has to, constantly pick himself up and dust himself off. And, how Dante connected that is what sort of good life seems to be for him, as opposed to just like letting things fall apart and then having to rebuild. And maybe this is the choice we have to make now as a people and as a generation, is the more you transform your ideal, the better transformative effect it has on you, the more you can continue to transform your ideal. And that means the better you become at making the future a better representation of your version of heaven. And I think if you've ever looked forward to a really awesome movie, and then you think of like sort of the socioeconomics of being able to produce a film and how much money we put into it and how awe-inspiring watching a film is, it's the ultimate religious experience, right? That it's that does seem to be what we have been doing as a people, as in the West. And I would very much like to be a part of making all of that even better.
Oh, well, as you were talking, I was thinking that maybe sports are also a really good example.
I agree.
Yeah, we've got to do some episodes then on sports, on music, on film and TV, perhaps. I think all these things will fit in really nicely here. We can find a way to weave it all together as we go along.
Well, I'm really excited about this, and I'm glad that we're tackling this territory and continuing to expand. I'm really eager to continue to test our minds against these whetstones, and to continue to sharpen them and see, just what we can see about what is happening around us. And hopefully those people that listen to us and we do have a pretty strong basis now. We had another 33% gain in listeners over the last month, up from 1,000 listens to 1,590, which is huge. Well, we're going to continue to produce as good a product as we can. We're going to do our best, and until we find that we're diluting the water. But I don't know. This has been a good, I think, combination of conscientiousness and creativity, Wes.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to where it goes from here.
Yeah. Well, let's keep at the Hephaestian Forge then. Until next time. Hopefully some stuff happens between now and then.
All right. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.